Ian is Professor of English at the University of Southern California. He's the recipient of many different awards and fellowships. Most recently, he was the Los Angeles Times Chair in the History and Culture of the Americas at the Huntington Library in California. He is also the current president of the Shakespeare Association of America. Black Shakespeare is one of the books that I've been proudest to publish while at Cambridge, and Ian is one of the most astute, important voices to listen to in literary studies today. So we're honoured to have Ian with us tonight. For those of you who have read Black Shakespeare, you'll know that it's a triumph of wide-ranging, incisive and politically urgent scholarship, and it's wonderful to be able to celebrate it with you in person. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Ian.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, folks, for coming. Good to see you all. It's my first time visiting Cambridge, and certainly at the bookstore. So I'm happy to be able to share a few words with you. I'm going to say talk a little bit about the book, and then afterwards, if you want, you can ask me other questions that are adjacent to the book, if you like. We'll be fine. I wanted to then talk a little bit about what led me to write this book, what led me to think about writing this book. And it has a lot to do with the formation of our field in early modern critical race studies. That is to say, from very early on, there was this continued sense of resistance to the field, and many critics have talked about that, and I'll refer to that in my sort of formal comments as I go along. The question was that why, what was this about, really? And so I tried to think that through, and the book is in part a project in reflecting on that why, okay? So I will read my formal comments, and then we'll have a good old time with Q&A afterwards. In his review of early modern scholarship for 2017, Henry Turner laments the paucity of only 2 race monographs, with the pride of publication going to eco-criticism and a focus on animal studies. Turner observes, put most sharply, we might wonder, how has it come to pass that the creaturely life of sheep, oranges, and yeast seem more significant than the life of Caliban, say, the lives of slaves and persons of color? I read Turner's critique not as a dismissal of any specific research agenda, but instead as an attempt to call attention to particular scholarly acts of deferral and displacement. The intense legitimate interest in creaturely life can work to suspend discussions of race, in effect urging us to look elsewhere, to look away from the uneasy questions of injustice to fellow humans and the role of whiteness in the historical arc of that display of inhumanity. At the end of the title essay from the collection Nobody Knows My Name, James Baldwin delivers his verdict on Americans' unwillingness to address the country's racial history. Quote, what it comes to finally, Baldwin writes, is that the nation has spent a large part of its time and energy looking away from one of the principal facts of its life. Baldwin's claim that Americans have expended considerable effort in looking away from the racial events of American life. In his case, the Scottsboro case of 9 black teens wrongfully convicted of rape in 1931, targeted attacks on returning post-World War II black servicemen, intense white reaction to school desegregation in 1954, these all-American examples, suggest not only a habit of conscious avoidance, but also the studied erasure of a history of black persons so that, to quote the titled essay, nobody knows my name. Baldwin's critique of denial has broad cultural relevance and is uniquely pertinent to the kinds of looking away in traditional Shakespeare criticism that effectively negate a Black presence, from Shakespeare to Baldwin and beyond to the emergence of early modern critical race studies in the 1990s. Denial and resistance to race have been the dominant critical stance. Yet, with every passing day, the increase in racial attacks and intensifying racist rhetoric confirm what has been a long and unbroken trajectory of racial oppression in American life. Churches, synagogues, borders, supermarkets, and schools no longer feel safe. Now, the early modern theater manifested a global awareness of Blackness through the multiple African characters in works by several writers, including Shakespeare, George Peele, George Chapman, Ben Jonson, John Webster, Middleton, and Richard Broome. The textual encoding of Blackness sets in relief the moment in early modern history when the presence of Blackness in the form of persons of Africans entered the lives of white Europeans, whether through trade, travel, and exploration, immigration, and perhaps most widely, through reading of various texts and the staged encounters of theatrical representation. Transported Africans, Black household servants, royal musicians, weavers, porters, mariners, and other laborers among the varied professions populate the historical and literary archives. Imported goods and fashionable items rehearse the Black presence in the residual cultural traces of their foreign affiliations. The scholarly denial of race is not due to a lack of material or archival evidence, as one might say. The title of the book, Black Shakespeare, then, is a recognition of this racial evidence that exists in the playwright's work. The second and important part of the book's thesis consists in identifying critics' response to that racial evidence. I argue that traditional reading and interpretive habits have left us unprepared to fully appreciate the racial content in Shakespeare's work, evidence that is often passed over or misrecognized. Beyond the critiques of simple resistance to race in traditional Shakespeare studies, however, as has been noted by many critics, I wish to propose a cause or reason for this tendency to racial erasure. To this end, I would highlight the reader-scholar's racial epistemology that guides what one sees and how one reads. The tension between the textual evidence of Blackness and the modern scholar reader's blindness to racial signs derives from cultural conditioning, intellectual formation, and epistemological predisposition, identified here for me as systemic whiteness that has created white preference and bias. The racial project of conquest, subjugation, and seizure initiated a history of white rule in the United States that was legitimized in its institutions and exercised with seeming impunity in every human sphere. This includes the racial hierarchy of legalized Black slavery and the instauration of white supremacy, Congressional Declaration of White Citizenship beginning in 1790, governmental manipulation of the census, the collapse of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow, exclusive immigration policies, especially since the 19th century, leading notably to the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 that lasted another 40 years, racially targeted restrictive voting rights laws, along with persistent authorized social discrimination up to the present in the judicial system, housing and labor markets, the military, and education. Omi and Wynand argue that racial dictatorship, quote, that's the term they use, in the United States has had three main consequences. It established whiteness as the defining American identity, authorized social organization along a color line, and consolidated racial identities such as black pursuant to the politics of slavery. Systemic whiteness, the racial framework within which Shakespeare criticism and scholarship have been produced for centuries and which reproduce that system itself, inhibits and constrains the practices of reading and interpretation. And this epistemological constraint is a legacy that affects us all because it is institutionally embedded in the culture. Thus, to discuss reading Shakespeare is not just to recognize, concede, or confront the culturally learned slippages and maneuvers of avoiding race, but also to locate whiteness within the enterprise and to understand whiteness itself as a source of racial blindness or of critical blind spots. To discuss reading Shakespeare, perhaps the most canonical of writers, is to admit that reading as a culturally embedded activity is informed by complex social pressures implied in the paradigm of seeing and not seeing race, accounting or not accounting for the institutional constraints of whiteness. Because race, through histories of service and enslavement, has been embedded in British and American life for centuries, exerting its influence on our thought and behavior. It is a matter not to be overlooked in our scholarly and daily lives if we expect or desire that scholarship to be humane, engaged, and in full dialogue with a range of contemporary readers. Thank you.